Number 2, y equals negative x minus 1. This might be, of the first 6 problems, this might be the trickiest one, because you really have to, let me show you what I mean. X equals 0. When you write the equation, you substitute the value, you substitute the input x. This negative x means the opposite of x. So y is equal to the opposite of 0 minus 1. Well, the opposite of 0 is just 0. So for 0, it's not so hard. Negative 0 is the same as positive 0. Neither one of them mean anything because 0 defines what's positive and negative. The things to the values to the right of 0 are positive, to the left are negative. 0 has no sign, so it's just 0. And 0 minus 1 is negative 1. So when your input is 0, your output is negative 1. Let me just take this expression for a second and remind you that subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. If we were subtracting positive 1, it's the same as adding negative 1. And 0 plus negative 1 is negative 1. So my first ordered pair, 0, negative 1. Whenever x is 0, you're finding the y-intercept. This line will intersect the y-axis at negative 1. That's an important point. We'll talk about that more later in the week. If I input a value of positive 1, if x equals positive 1, I write my equation, y equals negative x minus 1. Y equals, I'm just literally going to take that letter x, that variable x, and I'm going to replace it with a positive 1. So the opposite of x, the opposite of positive 1 is negative 1. The opposite of positive 1 is negative 1, right? So when I substitute positive 1, I get negative 1, and then I just write the rest of the equation, minus 1. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. And negative 1 plus negative 1 is negative 2. So when x is 1, y is negative 2. So our ordered pair is 1, negative 2. I graph it by going 1 to the right and down 2. Let's grab a negative value. Let's use a negative input and see what happens. If x is negative 1, I start with my equation. I don't input it until I write the equation first. And then when I substitute x, this equation says, this expression to the right of the equal sign says the opposite of x. So I'm going to write the opposite of whatever x is, negative 1. The opposite of negative 1 minus 1. Well, the opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. If you're subtracting negative 1, isn't that adding positive 1, adding the opposite? So I get 1 minus 1. And so when my input is negative 1, my output is actually 0. So that ordered pair is negative 1, comma 0. So 1 to the left for negative 1x, and then 0y means I don't go up or down at all. And that third point seems reasonable because when I visualize that line that I would get from those first two, I see that it would pass through that third point. And so you should have a downhill slope, and it should come close to the origin but not go through the origin. So if your line looks like mine, or you're pretty sure it does, you got it right. If it looks like something is, if it's going the other direction and if something went wrong, just mark it as minus 1.